You are standing in a kitchen in a small farmhouse north of Toronto. The mail is on the counter. A 9-year-old girl came home from school, brought it in, the way she always did. Then she vanished. Her bicycle is on its side outside. Her jacket is hanging on a hook too high for her to reach on her own. Someone else hung it there. She will not be found for 3 months. And when police finally find her killer, it will not be the stranger everyone feared. It will be a man who searched for her. A man who cried at her funeral. A man who sat across the table from her family and said nothing. For 36 years. Somewhere out there, right now, that man already knows exactly what he's done. Her name was Christine Marion Jessop. She was born on November 29th, 1974, in Queensville, Ontario, a small rural community about an hour's drive north of Toronto, the kind of place where most families knew each other by name and most front doors were never locked. She had sharp, quick features, a face full of freckles, and the kind of restless energy that made her impossible to keep indoors on a nice day. She was a tomboy who also kept a stuffed rabbit on her bed. She loved baseball and bike riding and climbing anything that could be climbed. Above all, she loved animals. She had a beagle named Freckles, and according to her mother, she once found a bat that had flown into her bedroom, and where anyone else would have screamed, she wanted to keep it as a pet. She talked about growing up to be a veterinarian. On the morning of October 3rd, 1984, she was upset. Her mother, Janet, and her older brother Ken were driving into Toronto that day, and Christine wanted to come. She was told she was too young for where they were going. She lost the argument and she got on the school bus anyway, the way she always did. At school that day, in music class, she was handed a small plastic recorder with her name written on a strip of paper taped to the side. It was an ordinary object, a woodwind instrument every child in that decade remembers learning to play. She carried it home with her, proud of it, planning to show it off. Queensville in 1984 was barely a town at all. A general store, a church, a cemetery, a playground with a baseball diamond. The kind of place where children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and parents didn't think twice about it because nothing bad had ever happened there. Christine had an older brother, Ken, 5 years her senior, who looked out for her the way older brothers do, half annoyance, half devotion. This was a family under some strain that fall, with their father away, but by every account, they were quiet, unremarkable, and entirely unthreatened. Christine's father, Bob Jessop, was not home that October. He was serving time at the Toronto East Detention Center, roughly 3 weeks into a sentence for misappropriating funds from a relative. It is not the center of this story, but it explains why, on this particular afternoon, Janet and Ken had plans to visit him, plans that would leave Christine alone in the house for a short stretch of time. Christine's school day ended in the early afternoon. She took the bus home, as always, and was dropped off a short distance from her house. Somewhere close to 4 o'clock, she let herself inside. She brought in the mail, she set down her backpack. Then, using a nickel she found in a jar of loose change, she walked to the corner store near her home to buy a piece of gum. The shopkeeper would later tell investigators she came in alone, sometime between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, bought her gum, and left within a minute. She was supposed to meet her friend Leslie at a nearby park after that. Leslie arrived. Christine never did. At around 4:10 in the afternoon, Janet and Ken pulled into the driveway, back from their trip into the city. And here is where the picture starts to feel wrong. The mail was inside. The backpack was on the counter. But Christine's red bicycle, the bike she treated like a prized possession, was lying on the ground, its kickstand bent beneath it. Her jacket was hanging on a hook far too high for her to reach on her own. Someone had been inside that house after Christine came home. Someone who was tall enough and comfortable enough to hang up a 9-year-old's coat as they lived there. At first, Janet wasn't alarmed. Kids wandered. Kids lost track of time. By 5 o'clock, with still no sign of her daughter, she walked to the park. She called the homes of every friend Christine had. Each call came back the same. Nobody had seen her. By early evening, Janet called the police. Think about what that gap actually means. Christine was seen alive, alone, walking toward a corner store sometime between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. Her mother and brother were back in the house by roughly 4:10. That is a window of perhaps 30 minutes, and probably far less, in which a 9-year-old girl bought a piece of gum and then simply never arrived at the park 2 minutes away. What followed was a search that pulled in hundreds of volunteers and consumed the small resources of the York Regional Police, a department that, in 1984, had roughly one officer for every 860 residents, and no major crimes unit of any kind. This was not a department built for a child abduction. A command post went up at the local fire hall. Lines of volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through open fields, through ditches, through the wooded margins of the town, moving slowly, told not to leave any gaps. Divers searched nearby ponds. Bob Jessop was released early, on humanitarian grounds, so he could join the search for his own daughter, whom he was not yet allowed to know was already gone. Missing person flyers went up across town, then across the region. Day after day, the search turned up nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, nothing at all. And in that same window, in the hours right after Christine's disappearance, a piece of evidence sat quietly in that kitchen and was thrown away without a second thought. The daily newspaper had been brought inside before Christine vanished, meaning whoever was in that house may have touched its plastic wrapping. Nobody dusted it. Nobody bagged it. It went in the trash. It would be decades before anyone understood what that single, careless mistake may have cost. For nearly 3 months, there was nothing. No trace, no word. The Jessops spent Christmas that year with an empty chair at the table, unwilling to put up a tree, still holding out hope. Then, on New Year's Eve, 1984, a man named Fred Patterson went looking for his dog on a wooded property outside the town of Sunderland, roughly 55 kilometers east of Queensville. Walking with his 2 daughters along a half-dug pit near a trail, he saw what he thought was a pile of garbage. It was Christine. Here is what the post-mortem revealed, delivered plainly, because that is the only respectful way to say it. Christine had suffered multiple severe sharp force injuries, fatal wounds that struck her spine. She had been subjected to a severe, violent physical attack. Investigators recovered fragments of the clothing she had worn that day, a single hair caught in the clasp of her necklace, and something else, something that would not mean anything for another 36 years. Degraded genetic material and foreign DNA preserved on her clothing. And beside her body, in the tall grass, they found her recorder, the one with her name written on it, the one she'd been so proud of on the last ordinary day of her life. Because her body was found across regional lines, the case shifted to Durham police and marked the start of the story's second tragedy. In 1984, DNA fingerprinting as we understand it today essentially did not exist. The semen evidence recovered from Christine's body could only be tested using basic blood grouping, a method broad enough to rule almost no one out. The single piece of evidence capable of identifying her real killer was, for the moment, useless. With no forensic path forward, investigators did something desperate investigators have done in cases before and since. They stopped looking for evidence, and they started looking for a person who simply felt wrong to them. The lead detective on the case, Robert Brown, reportedly split his investigators into 2 competing teams and made it known that whichever team produced a viable suspect first would take over the case. Think about what that does to an investigation. It does not reward patience. It rewards speed. 2 detectives, Bernie Fitzpatrick and John Shepard, known around the department as Fitz and Shep, took up that challenge. They inherited boxes of notes compiled by the original York force, records that, by at least one later account, already contained the name of a family friend connected to the Jessops through his wife. That name was set aside, dismissed as the work of an amateur department that, in their view, hadn't known what it was doing. It would not surface again for 36 years. Here is what Fitz and Shep did not know they were walking past. In the earliest weeks of the investigation, other names came and went. A family friend known for making dark, unsettling comments. A neighborhood boy who carried a knife. For a brief period, even Janet Jessop herself was quietly looked at. None of it led anywhere. On February 14th, 1985, the investigation turned toward the Jessops' next-door neighbor, a 24-year-old furniture factory worker named Paul Morin. And here is the uncomfortable truth about how he became a suspect. It wasn't physical evidence. It wasn't a broken alibi. It was a single line from Janet Jessop, describing him as, in her words, a weird type of guy. Morin was quiet. He kept bees. He played the clarinet in a small community band. He lived at home with his parents. He hadn't joined the search parties for Christine, and he hadn't attended her funeral. To the detectives working the case, that silence read as guilt. Here is what those detectives did not know, or did not want to know. Morin had a time card. Records showed he punched out of his job in Newmarket at 3:32 in the afternoon on October 3rd, a job located roughly 57 kilometers from his home. Simple math said he could not have reached Queensville before roughly 4:14. His own family placed his arrival home even later, somewhere between 5 and 5:30. Janet and Ken, remember, had returned home at 4:10. The window for Morin to have intercepted Christine, on paper, essentially did not exist. So investigators went back to the one part of the timeline that was not fixed. Over repeated conversations that should never have happened the way they did, Janet's memory of that afternoon began to shift. What had started as a clear 4:10 arrival slowly stretched under sustained and gentle pressure towards somewhere between 4:20 and 4:35. A window that had not existed now did. A few weeks later, an undercover officer, introduced to Morin through his community band as a hairdressing student needing samples for a class project, collected a strand of his hair. It was sent to a forensic scientist who examined it under a microscope next to a hair recovered from the clasp of Christine's necklace. The two hairs were, in the scientist's words, microscopically similar and consistent. What almost nobody explained to the jury that would later hear this evidence was that microscopic hair comparison cannot identify a specific person. At best, it can exclude someone who obviously does not match. It is not a fingerprint. It is closer to a coin flip dressed up in a lab coat. Fibers recovered from Morin's car were presented as proof that Christine had been inside it. Years later, it would come out that the lab technician handling those fibers had been wearing a red sweater during testing without a lab coat, in a shared space where cross-contamination was entirely possible. A cigarette butt recovered near the crime scene simply disappeared from the evidence file. Morin did not smoke. An officer who had worked the original crime scene was later found to have kept two separate sets of notes, one of them rewritten in a way that better suited the case against Morin. Investigators brought in a behavioral profile from the FBI, describing a white male between 19 and 26 years old, likely local to Queensville. It was presented to the press with certain details omitted, details that, by some accounts, did not comfortably fit Morin at all. Here is the detail nobody said out loud at the time. That same profile technically excluded a 28-year-old man living in Scarborough, a man named Calvin Hoover. Guy Paul Morin was arrested on April 22, 1985, on his way to band practice. He was charged with first-degree murder. His first trial began in January of 1986 in London, Ontario. His defense, facing an already thin body of evidence, made an unusual choice, introducing psychiatric testimony, suggesting Morin suffered from schizophrenia, arguing that even if the evidence somehow implicated him, he could not be held criminally responsible. On February 7, 1986, the jury acquitted him. That should have been the end of it. It was not. The Crown appealed the verdict, arguing the trial judge had misdirected the jury on the burden of proof. In June of 1987, the Ontario Court of Appeal ordered a new trial, a decision the Supreme Court of Canada upheld in November of 1988. At Morin's second trial, the Crown leaned harder on forensic testimony and brought in two jailhouse informants, men with their own histories of dishonesty and their own reasons to want favor with the Crown, who testified that Morin had confessed to them in custody. One of them told the court that Morin had described committing the murder using a phrase borrowed from a horror film he'd recently seen, a phrase about redoing or redrumming the innocent. It sounded damning in a courtroom. It was, in truth, nothing more than a mangled reference to a movie Morin had mentioned watching. Years later, when investigators questioned that informant again, he admitted he had been hoping his testimony would shorten his own sentence, and that he could no longer be certain of what he had actually heard in that cell. At the time of the trial, none of that uncertainty reached the jury. A psychologist also testified that Morin's own parents, who insisted their son hadn't arrived home until well after Christine disappeared, were not telling the truth so much as protecting him, part, the psychologist suggested, of a closed-off, secretive family system. There was no evidence for that claim beyond the fact that the family loved their son and believed he was innocent. On July 30th, 1992, Guy Paul Morin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Here is what nobody in that courtroom knew: a method of genetic testing called polymerase chain reaction, capable of amplifying tiny amounts of degraded genetic material into an individualized DNA profile, was just beginning to enter forensic use. It was about to do what microscopic hair comparison and contaminated fibers never could. Every case on this channel is weeks of digging, real records, real families. If this one is sitting with you, take 10 seconds, hit like, and subscribe. It's what keeps Cold Case Narrator going and keeps cases like this from being forgotten. There's still a name that needs to be said. Stay with us. In January of 1995, joint testing between Ontario's Centre of Forensic Sciences and an independent laboratory produced a conclusive genetic profile from the crime scene evidence more than a decade earlier. It excluded Guy Paul Morin completely. On January 23, 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal set aside his conviction and formally acquitted him. He had spent 18 months in prison and roughly a decade of his life under the weight of a murder prosecution for a crime he did not commit. In a public statement, Morin said this: "I am relieved for Christine's mother, Janet, and her family, and hope this will give them some peace of mind. When DNA exonerated me in January of 1995, I was sure that one day DNA would reveal the real killer, and now it has." On January 24, 1997, the government of Ontario awarded Morin and his parents $1.25 million in compensation. It could not return the decade. The province ordered a public inquiry led by retired Judge Fred Kaufman. The hearings began in February of 1997 and ran for 146 days, hearing testimony from 120 witnesses and reviewing more than 100,000 pages of documents. When the Kaufman report was released in April of 1998, it ran to 1,380 pages across 2 volumes and made 119 recommendations. Its central finding was blunt. Investigators had displayed, in Kaufman's own words, tunnel vision of the most staggering proportions. Kaufman summarized the entire tragedy in a single line that has followed this case ever since. An innocent person was convicted of a heinous crime he did not commit. Science helped convict him. Science exonerated him. Janet Jessop, sitting through that inquiry, said something that has stayed with everyone who has studied this case since. This inquiry, she said, was not about Christine. It was about Mr. Morin. She was right. And it meant that after 13 years, after 2 trials, after a public apology and over $1 million in compensation, the Jessop family still did not know who had murdered their daughter. For years, the case went cold. In 1995, jurisdiction passed to the Toronto Police, who assembled a 9-person task force. They interviewed more than 300 people and collected DNA elimination samples from dozens of men. None of it produced a match. By the late 1990s, the task force disbanded. The file was handed to a cold case unit, where it sat, reopened periodically, chased down through hundreds of tips over the following decades without ever producing a name. That changed in May of 2019. A Toronto cold case detective named Steve Smith sat in on a seminar at the Ontario Police College on a technique barely used anywhere in Canada: forensic genetic genealogy. The idea was simple. Take degraded DNA from a crime scene, run it not against a criminal database, but against consumer ancestry databases, the same kind ordinary people use to find long-lost relatives. Then build backward, generation by generation, toward a single name. Smith partnered with Othram Incorporated, a forensic genomics laboratory based in Houston, Texas, for a fee that, by some accounts, ran to roughly $1,800 American dollars. It must have seemed at the time like a small price for a case that had already cost 35 years. The degraded forensic sample, still sitting in evidence storage, was sequenced using a method capable of reading hundreds of thousands of genetic markers far beyond what standard forensic testing could ever capture. That profile was uploaded to a genealogy database called GE.Match, the same kind of platform ordinary people use to find long-lost relatives. The first search returned roughly 33,000 possible genetic relatives. A second search, run through a different platform, narrowed that number to somewhere around 400. As one senior officer explained it afterward, this is not a fingerprint match. It provides, in his words, a potential family lineage from a DNA sample, and then it becomes the work of a police investigator to build out from that potential lineage, through interviews, through historical records, through old newspaper archives, until a family tree takes shape. Smith called what he was hoping to find the golden goose, a parent, a sibling, a child of the unknown killer, someone close enough in the tree to make the search collapse quickly. He did not get that. What he got instead was months of painstaking work. Forensic genealogist Anthony Redgrave led the effort to turn a list of distant genetic cousins into an actual family tree. Over months, his team traced the lines of descent backward, generation by generation, until they converged on a common ancestor named Henry Hoover Jr., born in 1804 in Lennox, Ontario. From there, the work moved forward again, branch by branch, narrowing an enormous sprawling family tree down to 2 possible living family lines. Detectives quietly investigated both, and then, in the fall of 2020, one name emerged that fit every piece of the puzzle. Detective Smith had never heard it before. It had never appeared in a single one of the thousands of tips gathered over 36 years. Calvin Hoover. When Smith cross-referenced that name against the case's old files, stored now on a modern police database, he got a hit. An old Scarborough address tied to Calvin Hoover appeared in one of the original York Regional Police notebooks, compiled in the very first days of the investigation. In 1984, the name had been sitting there the entire time. Here is what those first officers did not know, and what it would take 36 years to understand. Calvin Dana Hoover was 28 years old in the fall of 1984. He worked as a cable installer for a company called Eastern Independent Telecom, alongside Bob Jessop, who was the lead hand on his installation crew. The two men were not just co-workers, they were friends. Their families spent time together, birthdays, barbecues, weekend visits. Hoover's wife, Heather, worked at the same company in dispatch and had become one of Janet Jessop's closest friends. She babysat Christine regularly. Christine called her Auntie Heather. 2 days before Christine disappeared, on October 1st, 1984, Janet visited the Hoovers at their home. During that visit, she mentioned her upcoming trip to see Bob at the detention center, and mentioned that Christine, being too young to come along, would be home alone for a short window of time after school. Whether Calvin Hoover heard that directly or was told afterward by his wife, he now had exactly the information he needed. He knew a 9-year-old girl who trusted him completely was about to be alone. Investigators believed that on the afternoon of October 3rd, Hoover drove to Queensville. Because Christine knew him as a family friend, someone she had grown up around, she likely approached his car without fear, possibly believing she was simply going somewhere with someone her parents trusted. From there, investigators believe he drove her roughly 55 kilometers to a remote, wooded area near Sunderland, a location he reportedly knew well from years of camping and kayaking trips with an old friend who lived nearby. And then he went home. When his wife came back from work that evening and learned Christine was missing, Calvin Hoover joined the search parties. In the weeks that followed, he attended her wake. He attended her funeral. He stood, by some accounts, close enough to the investigating officers photographing mourners for suspicious behavior that they may have captured his face on film without ever knowing what they were looking at. On October 9th, 2020, forensic scientists compared a DNA sample quietly preserved from Calvin Hoover's own autopsy 5 years earlier against the crime scene profile recovered from Christine's underwear in 1984. It was a match. On October 15th, 2020, Toronto's interim police chief, James Raymer, stood in front of cameras and said the words that 36 years of investigation had been building toward. If he were alive today, Raymer said, the Toronto Police Service would arrest Calvin Hoover for the murder of Christine Jessop. But Calvin Hoover was not alive. 5 years earlier, in the summer of 2015, struggling for years with anxiety, addiction, and what would later be understood as untreated bipolar disorder, he had taken his own life. Under Canadian law, there could be no trial for a man who was no longer living. The case was, in the words investigators used, solved, but it would never be tested in a courtroom. There would be no verdict, no sentencing, no moment where Calvin Hoover was made to answer for what he had done. For the Jessop family, that resolution arrived as something complicated, part relief, part fresh grief. Bob Jessop told reporters that day that he felt sickened, and that as he had gotten older, he had wondered whether he would live to see this moment at all. Ken Jessop, who had been 14 years old when his sister disappeared, said that for the first time in 36 years, his mother would not go to bed praying to find out who killed her daughter. "It's a miracle," he said. "I can't find another word for it." For Heather Hoover, the news arrived as its own kind of devastation. For years, she had kept the last school photo Christine ever gave her displayed in her home, a reminder of the little girl she had once babysat, searched for, and grieved alongside her closest friend. Now she learned that the man she had shared a home and raised children with for years had been the one who took her. If the cops had done their job a little better, she told a reporter afterward, things could have been so different. Guy Paul Morin, in a statement, said he was relieved for Christine's family and grateful that police had stayed on the case long enough to finally solve it. His defense lawyer, Clayton Ruby, speaking publicly the same night, put it plainly. "We now know who did it," he said, "and it wasn't Guy Paul. He did nothing wrong." Ruby also said something that reaches well beyond this one case, about what a wrongful conviction actually costs a person. "You never recover," he said. "It's never the same as it was before." Asked what this case had changed, Ruby didn't talk about forensic procedure. He talked about trust. "We tend to trust prosecutors," he said, "when they tell us they have enough evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that puts an accused person at an overwhelming disadvantage that isn't written into the law, but exists in a very real sense." This case, he said, taught the public to be more skeptical of certainty itself. And that skepticism, he added, makes us all safer. Investigators later described what happened to this case using a term that has become common in the study of wrongful convictions: tunnel vision, sometimes called noble cause corruption, a single-minded focus on one theory so complete that it reshapes how every new piece of evidence gets read. Nobody involved, Kaufman concluded, set out to convict an innocent man. They simply stopped being able to see any other possibility. Innocence Canada, the organization that grew directly out of Morin's case, publicly called for a review of exactly how Calvin Hoover evaded scrutiny for 3 decades, despite his name sitting in the original file from nearly the very beginning. Investigators still don't know if Calvin Hoover acted alone or if Christine was his only victim. Solved and answered are not quite the same thing here. Investigators have never fully reconstructed what Calvin Hoover did in the 31 years between Christine's murder and his death. What is not open to question is the impact this case had on Canadian criminal justice. The Kaufman Report's 119 recommendations reshaped how Canadian police handle jailhouse informants, forensic evidence and interrogation practices, reforms that are still in place today. And the technique that finally identified Calvin Hoover, forensic genetic genealogy, was being used in Canada for the very first time. It is the same category of technique that identified the Golden State Killer in California 2 years earlier. Since this case, it has been used to help solve cold cases across the country. That same technique has raised a question nobody has fully answered yet. The distant cousins whose ancestry results helped identify Calvin Hoover never agreed to be part of a murder investigation. They uploaded their DNA out of curiosity to learn about their family history, and in doing so, unknowingly handed police a map that led straight to a killer they had never met. It is hard to argue with the outcome in this case. It is much harder to say, with any confidence, where that same tool stops being justice and starts being something closer to surveillance. That conversation among privacy advocates, investigators, and lawmakers is still ongoing. Guy Paul Morin, for his part, rebuilt a private life largely out of the public eye. He married, became self-employed doing small mechanical repair work, and has remained connected to Innocence Canada, the organization his own case helped bring into existence, an organization that continues fighting for other people convicted of crimes they did not commit. But as forensic genealogy keeps digging up decades-old ghosts, one question keeps following this case around. How many other cold files, sitting right now in police archives across this country, are waiting on nothing more than a simple DNA search to expose a killer who has been hiding in plain sight the entire time? Janet Jessop spent the rest of her life searching for an answer, and in March of 2024, at the age of 81, she passed away. On October 3rd of that year, exactly 40 years to the day after Christine disappeared, her son Ken, later to rest in the small cemetery behind the home where they once lived, in Queensville, finally reunited with Christine. She was 9 years old. She was quick and freckled and never still for long. She loved baseball. She loved bicycles. She loved a beagle named Freckles more than almost anything in the world. She was the kind of child who found a bat in her bedroom and, where anyone else would have screamed, wanted to keep it. She was 9 years old, and she wanted to be a veterinarian. She was 9 years old, and she brought in the mail before anyone asked her to. She was 9 years old, and she left her bike exactly where she always left it, until the one day she didn't. And that single detail was the first thing that told the people who loved her something was wrong. She was 9 years old, and she carried a small plastic recorder home from school, proud of it, with her own name written on a strip of paper taped to the side, never knowing it would be the last thing she was ever seen carrying. She should be 51 years old today. She should have grown up. She should have had the ordinary, unremarkable life that was taken from her on an October afternoon in 1984. A life full of the small things she loved. Dogs, bicycles, baseball, whatever she would have grown into instead of the 9-year-old girl, frozen forever at the edge of a wooded field in Sunderland, Ontario. Here is the lesson this case leaves behind, and it is not a comfortable one. For 13 years, an entire justice system built its certainty on a feeling, on one line describing a quiet neighbor as a weird type of guy, and it very nearly cost an innocent man his entire life, while the real killer stood close enough to be photographed at a funeral. Certainty is not the same thing as truth. The people closest to a tragedy, the ones who seem the most obviously trustworthy, the ones who bring casseroles and join search parties and stand at the graveside, deserve exactly the same scrutiny as the strangers everyone is quick to suspect. No more and no less. That is not cynicism. It is what actual justice requires, and it is the single lesson this family paid 36 years to teach the rest of us. If this case stayed with you, and it should, hit like, subscribe, and tell us which moment landed hardest for you. Was it the bicycle on the ground, the recorder in the grass, or the funeral where a killer stood in plain sight and no one there had any idea? You've been watching Cold Case Narrator, where cold cases get the heat they deserve. No case stays cold forever. We'll see you in the next one.